now the average person is not walking around with the mark of Cain as a racial category in their mind, but we are all affected by the lie of white supremacy to think that black is villainous. So that was kind of one part of where we were. The last piece that we left off was we also looked at Phyllis Wheatley and Leslie. Second one. Lastly, okay. I was like, it's not Leslie, it's close, lastly. Okay. When we were talking about Phyllis Wheatley and her famous poem on being brought from Africa to America, and that beautiful last line about the Negro, though black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train, as an idea of kind of a subversive way of appropriating that. And so part of what we looked at in our last class were the ways in which African Americans have taken some of these narratives and inverted them and found within them kind of a liberative possibility. So that's where we were looking at with the black religious movements and what I called racialized theodicy. So as a slightly longer review, but since a number of people had thoughts, I was like, we need to unpack this more. So it started with the idea of what is theodicy. And so the kind of seminary day one definition, and systematic theologians will nuance this and make it much more complicated, but you will not fail if you remember this definition. All right? That theodicy asks the question, given an omnipotent, that is an all-powerful God, and an omnibenevolent, that is an all-good God, how does one explain the existence of evil? Right? If God is all-powerful and God is all-good, why is there evil? And again, just turn on the news and you'll see a litany of evils. So people ask, how can God and that coexist? One strategy that has developed in black religious movements, some Christian, some non-Christian, over the course of the last 200-ish years, has been what I call racialized theodicy. The argument that gets raised here is, can one explain the existence of black suffering, the evils that black people have experienced, through a racialized lens? And so we talked about the texts we had been studying were ways in which the lie of white supremacy justified certain texts to rationalize exploitation. These movements start with the opposite question, which is, given our domination, given our subjugation, how do we understand God and evil to be at work in that? And so they begin by trying to ask, can we answer this question by the category of whiteness, or what I call the lie of white supremacy? Perhaps not surprisingly, there were answers that they found from Scripture. And I mentioned Dr. Junior's article, a relatively recent treatment of this. But one of the texts that is common is in 2 Kings 5, verses 20 through 27, which is the story of Gehazi. So, from what I remember, not everyone was familiar with that story. So I thought we could read that story together. So we'll read starting in verse 20 through verse 27. So 2 Kings 5, verse 20 through 27. Don't know where the mic, okay. Someone has the mic, so.
We read by one verse
Yeah,
at a time.
so if each person can just take one verse.
We read by one verse at a time. Would you like to start by? All right, I'll start.
Okay.
But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance.
You're going to have to pass it by.
All right. Stuart, you can do the next one.
Gehazi, the servant
Oops, sorry, I was blowing it up for.
Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, my master has let that Aramean Naaman off too lightly by not accepting from him what he offered. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something out of him.
So Gehazi went after Naaman. When Naaman saw someone running after him, he jumped down from the chariot to meet him and said, "Is everything all right?"
He replied, "Yes, but my master has sent me to say, 2 members of a company of prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing."
Naaman said, "Please accept 2 talents." He urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing and gave them to 2 of his servants, who carried them in front of Gehazi.
When he came to the citadel, he took the bags from them and stored them inside. He dismissed the men, and they left.
He went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" He answered, "Your servant has not gone anywhere at all."
But he said to him, "Did I not go with you in spirit when someone left his chariot to meet you? Is this a time to accept money and to accept clothing, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, and male and female slaves?"
Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he left his present leprous, as white as snow.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. So, this becomes one of the central passages in these Black religious movements regarding racialized theodicy. Perhaps my second dumbest question of our 6 weeks together. How might that get applied in context of racialized theodicy? I'll give you a hint, it's in the very last verse. Right, exactly. So part of how the argument develops in these traditions is they ask the question that is assumed in the racialized interpretations we saw of Cain. Is there evidence that God judges someone and their judgment results in the change of their skin color? Those who interpret the mark of Cain, the answer is, well, of course it is, and that's how you get Black people. Black religious movement said, well, if Cain is from the continent of Africa and West Asia, right, turning a brown man Black doesn't do much. You just got a suntan, right? But what would make a difference? The argument they raised is if a Black person became white, that would really stand out. So, as most exegetes and reception historians do, they ask, well, is there a place where we find God judging someone and turning their skin white? Naaman. And an important thing that Cain does not have. There's no evidence in Genesis 4 that the mark of Cain attaches to his descendants forever. This one answers that. So he left his presence leprous, as white as snow. And before that, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So for Black religious movements who have this racialized theodicy, this is their answer for how whiteness is a sign of divine judgment. They then ask, well, if this is divine judgment in the biblical world, is there evidence of this in the modern world? Their argument is study European history and American history. So David Walker will famously write in his Appeal to Negroes, which will later get absorbed through centuries and a half into the Nation of Islam. They will ask the question, what group of people has pillaged more land, kidnapped more people, assaulted more folk than those whose skin is leprous and as white as snow? So their argument becomes, how do we understand the presence of Black evil and Black suffering? White evil, white conquest. Because this story is all about taking what doesn't belong to you and doing so in the name of God, or in this case, in God's prophet Elisha. So this becomes a standard trope that you can trace for about 2 centuries in Black religious thought. I will pause there. That's a lot. That's a lot, but I will pause there. Questions, comments, queries, consternations, all of the above. Yes, sir.
It's interesting that they mention slaves in that
Yeah.
passage. I think that, otherwise, it's kind of like God overreacted. You know, it's a little bit more than what Cain did, a little bit less than what Cain did, but then suddenly when you talk about taking male and female slaves,
Right.
that maybe that justifies God's reaction here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this question of kind of, as we'll see with Ham in a moment, what's the sin that provokes God's anger so much? Because oftentimes it seems as though God overreacts. But as you said, if we look at kind of the ways in which all that was involved, then we begin to make an argument for why God's actions are reasonable, that he is the just judge. Yeah. Cool. Other thoughts, queries? One thing just of curiosity for myself, how many have ever heard this kind of argument before? No one, okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, so a couple of people have, but the majority, this is new. Yes, sir.
Yes, my observation is if any of us want to get into an eisegetical arms race, nobody's going to win.
Right, right, exactly. And so part of that, kind of that, I like that phrase, the eisegetical arms race. Part of it is trying to understand what are the motivations and how does the logic cohere. Because again, this is still part of the culture that you'll encounter in a lot of different ways. Saw 3 hands, 1, 2, 3. Yes, sir.
Where would we see this argument in American history? Like secular world that's looking at the Bible, talking about the Bible in the 19th century, let's say, I don't know. I mean, where would this be talked about?
Yeah, so there are a couple places where you would see this. So one, you would see it in various Black sermonic traditions and Black literature. In kind of 20th and 21st century, one of the vestiges of this is if you listen carefully to hip hop, if you listen carefully to the 5% movement, if one listens carefully to one strand of the Nation of Islam, you will hear this kind of argument picked up. And so I enjoy hip hop, I'm not a hip hop scholar by profession, I just like it. But one of the things that scholars will argue about is this tradition of Black nationalism or pro-Africanism. One element of some of the traditions is this kind of idea of the robbing of, the mislabeling of evil as Black rather than as white. If you're on Instagram and go down a rabbit hole, which I occasionally find myself doing, there's a really interesting brother, I can see his face, head of the Hebrew Israelites in New York City. Gosh, anyway, his name will come to me eventually. He invokes this in the critique of the attack on critical race theory. Because his argument is critical race theory exposes the true nature of whites as these thieves. And America is fighting to keep that truth out of our schools, to keep the Black man bound. And so those kinds of movements is where you'll hear it most in the 20th and 21st century. Yes, sir.
Well, my observation on this is that it's frustrating to me because both sides, whether you're looking at the Cain story or this, are picking their point of view and then going and flipping through the Bible to find where there's something in there that supports the point of view they already had, as opposed to going through and trying to understand what the point of view that is kind of supposed to be coming out of the text. At least that's my feeling on it.
Yeah, there's definitely kind of that sort of eisegetical, but for each of those groups, how they view themselves is they are looking at the Bible to explain the world as they experienced it. And so again, sitting back, we can critique it that way, and I think most, if not all of us, would agree with that. But from their perspective, this is the best explanation for the world as is, and God told us this from the beginning, right? So the Nation of Islam, for example, will kind of make this argument that if you understand the inherent nature of what whites are, then that changes how you interact with them. Right? There's a great phrase, my version of it, is that there is no hope without truth. Because without truth, hope is simply a delusion and a fantasy. So it's my remix of it. And so part of what they argue is once we learn this truth as they understand it, then we can build real hope. And in another class, we can talk about what that hope looks like. But That's part of how they internally view it. But I agree with you from the external critique. But for both those who imbibe the lie of white supremacy regarding Cain and those who do black religious movements, for them, this is the explanation of the world as God created it. I thought there was one other hand. No, maybe not. Okay. Cool. Any last lingering thoughts on that before we jump back to the other end of the spectrum? Yes.
I noticed that this was in the news several different places, that Ninth Wonder is a professor at Duke University and NCCU. Does he teach any of this as part of what he's doing at those institutions?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know, actually. I don't know if anyone else knows kind of the background, but no, I'm not sure. Cool. All right. So part of what I wanted to do as we kind of get ready for our last kind of class and a half is zoom back out to frame kind of where we've been going and where we've traveled. The basic idea that I've been trying to lay is that at the foundation of America's racial caste system, which is a phrase that grows out of the work of Isabel Wilkerson, is these three pillars of the primeval history. And as we mentioned in our very first class, part of what I want to suggest is that they were very intentional about going to the beginning, to Genesis, to try to find that divine blueprint. And so what this class has been about in the book that I'm writing, which this class is an expression of that, is really that there are three kind of key texts that define how blackness comes to be understood in America. So the first, which we just kind of looked at, was the idea of the mark of Cain. And that gives you the nature of blackness, right? Or what I've called the 3 Ds. Again, what can be more dangerous, depraved, or deviant than killing your brother because your offering was not deemed sufficient before God, right? And that's part of what 1 John pulls on that. So if we have blacks as dangerous, deviant, depraved, we then have to ask, how do they fit in our society? And for me, that's what Ham's curse, and I put Ham in air quotes, you'll see why in a moment. Ham's curse in Genesis 9. One of the things that we'll talk about is that the so-called curse of Ham is the most common Hebrew Bible text used to justify enslavement of blacks. Right, so Genesis 9, or so-called curse of Ham, is the dominant Hebrew Bible text to justify the enslavement of Africans. Once enslavement ends, do not fear, this story does not die. Instead, it gets extrapolated to argue for the place of blacks in society. So if we were once destined by God to be enslaved, slaves are at the bottom of the pyramid in societal structure. So though enslavement ends, the black place remains. And you'll see arguments in the 20th century appealing to the curse of Ham to explain segregation. There's several famous economists. Glenn Lowry is the one who comes to mind right now, who makes the comment that between 1619 and 1957, the average black woman worked as a domestic servant for 338 years. And domestic servant's a nice, clean way. For the first 250, that was an enslaved woman. And then until 1957, right? My mother is the first woman in my immediate family to never clean a white person's toilets. Every other woman in my family has. And that grows out in part of this application of the curse of Ham. Then finally, Genesis 10, which is what we'll close with in our next class. So if we have the nature of blackness in the mark of Cain, we have the place of black people in Genesis 9, then you have to ask, well, where'd they come from? Genesis 10 gives us what scholars, and I use this phrase as well, Hamitic Africa. That is the idea that Ham is the father of everyone who comes from the African continent. Everyone on the African continent is black. So therefore, putting all three of these together, if the continent of Africa is Hamitic, then what is the place of everyone who is from Ham, or from the land of Africa? They're to be enslaved, or at the bottom of the rung. Why do they belong there? Because blackness means dangerous, depraved, deviant. And so these three, I argue, create a perfect feedback loop that keeps the argument of why blacks belong where they belong and why Africa is a bleep hole country. It's a consequence of this kind of logic. So that's kind of my last zoom out before we dive back in. Hopefully not too much vertigo in the zooming in and out. But questions about that framework? Okay, so we turn now to the curse of Ham. But before we get to the text, I want to give you sort of a famous representation of what the curse of Ham in Genesis 10 tells us. So from the picture you see on the screen, let me click on it to zoom in a little bit for everyone. Right, what do you notice about these three individuals?
Well, he's the darkest.
Right, difference in skin color, Ham is the darkest. One on the left, yes, Japheth looks wealthiest, yeah. If you had to assign a race to each of these three people, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, what race would you assign them? So let's start with Japheth. What race is he?
White.
He's white. What race would you assign to Ham?
Black.
That is my dumbest question of the 6 weeks. What race would you assign to Shem?
Asian. Middle Eastern.
Exactly, Asian, indigenous, Arab, exactly. So this is part of this biblical anthropology. This one is from 1920, if I remember correctly. I can get the specific source, but it's a common representation that we can find as early as like 1500s. And part of the question that's being asked here is, go back to our good old days of Sunday school and vacation Bible school. After the flood ends, who are the only human beings left on the earth?
Noah's family.
Right, Noah's family. So, for centuries, it was assumed that all of Noah's kids were the same race. Right, and that, again, not a geneticist, but I'm pretty sure if mom and dad are the same race and they procreate, the kids will be the same race. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right. It's been about 35 years since I took biology, okay? That creates a problem for biblical interpreters, which is if Noah and Mrs. Noah, who's unnamed, have kids, how are Gemini from the same stock? So they begin saying, well, maybe Noah's 3 kids weren't all of the same race. And they were not of the same race because they were of different colors. So we'll unpack this more next week, but give you a preview of coming attractions. Japheth becomes white for 2 primary reasons. The meaning of his name in Hebrew, which is connected to this notion of beauty. And as one of my favorite writers in the 17th century says, what is more beautiful than white? The second reason Japheth becomes white is Japheth gets what we will now consider modern day Europe, according to the Table of Nations. We'll unpack Ham today in more depth. But again, the picture probably tells you everything you need to know about the next 30 minutes of our class. Then Shem. Shem becomes the challenging one, in part because Shem and Ham share some of the same lands. But the biblical anthropologists who were constructing the system began saying, okay, from white and black, I can get a lot, but not everything. How do I get red from white and black? I can understand shades of brown, but where does red come from? Where does yellow come from? Again, that old Vacation Bible School song, red and yellow, black and white, we are precious in his sight. So the argument is then there had to be one of Noah's sons who was red, yellowish. That red, yellowish person was Shem. And a really ingenious, although deeply problematic argument is the name Adamah, from which the word Adam comes from, has a secondary root that means red, or it's associated with redness. So the argument then becomes the original humans were reddish beings. Shem reflects that original reddishness. And so we now have these three, white, black, reddish. And they felt between those three interminglings, you can get the full rainbow of the human spectrum. Now, again, geneticists would raise some questions about that. But geneticists in the 18th and 19th century did not. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I don't have the dates, but I've read several things along the way recently that talk about just the whole notion of race per se as a pretty recent construct, sort of political ideological construct.
Right.
You're saying the pictures here are 15th century. So were there efforts to if you want to say, interpret scripture in a way to accommodate the presence of different races before there was a sort of a strong ideological development of the concept of race, or no?
Yeah, so the way I've seen many historians answer it, and I have no reason to disbelieve them yet, but let you know in a year when the project is done, is starting with the age of European expansion and colonialism, particularly into the continent of Africa, starting around the 15th century with the Portuguese. There is an encounter with a large segment of the world that looks less like Japheth, more like Ham and Shem. And so by the 15th century, we begin getting arguments that say the Black African or Negro of African race, right, is something wholly different from those of us who are of Japhetic lineage. And so there's a quick collapsing of color with civilization and culture and therefore political access and power. So when scholars talk about the construction of race as a social caste, in which power, economics, et cetera, are all woven together, you can argue that there's an intellectual trajectory that takes us back to that moment in the 15th century. And any good 15th century person trying to justify what they do, one of the resources at hand is the Bible, right? So early ethnography and anthropology, early what would later come and reaches apex or zenith, depending on who's telling the story, with Darwinism in the 19th century, are all ways in which all of these things kind of collide. And so the 19th century is that perfect storm, like we talked about with polygenesis, where all of these different traditions merge to create kind of this platform. Yes, Leslie.
Was that also an outgrowth of the Crusades?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the connections that gets made, scholar at Stanford who did her book Heathen, talks about part of what quickly happens is the heathen as the religious other takes on the framework as the uncivilized other. And that uncivilized other quickly gets defined along color lines, which is connected to geography, which then gets connected to race. So then we just take out all the middleman and say race equals heathen. And that launches us into some parts of the American experiment. Yes.
I was recently speaking with a colleague about the class that we're doing here, and the colleague at work was saying kind of something that I had forgotten to share with you, but I'll share with you now, was kind of lest we think this trajectory is an ancient relic, sent me two references to, one was a Georgia minister, who was making that argument just right along those lines, that the benefits of the institution of chattel slavery was taking heathens, and that was sort of the benefit of it, is that otherwise Black folk would remain heathens in Africa. And so she sent me several modern appropriations of that, one 2020 and one more recently than that. If anybody wants to know who these people are, it's on my phone, but I won't name them here because I know this is recorded. But you know, that's something that she wanted to share with you.
Yeah, you did actually share that with me.
Oh, good.
For those who don't know, this is my wife, the other Dr. Kemp, or Dr. G. So you'll see that pop up in a lot of different contexts. 5-second story, I had a student in class when I taught this 2 years ago make that exact same argument and talked about that's how his church taught him what slavery was and why people should not object to it, because it was a means of converting Blacks from worshiping of stones to worshiping of the one true God. And this young man was like 24. So it's very much alive and well. Yes.
So when and where and how does anti-Semitism come in?
Yes. So very early. So it'll go back for a second. So when we talk about the villainy of Cain, very early in the Christian tradition, between Origen and St. Augustine are the two that immediately come to mind, there is an argument that Jews represent Cain because they are, again, the ultimate religious other, and they are the ones who kill the ultimate innocent sacrifice, right? Remember we talked about Abel develops his reputation as the righteous one. Well, the ultimate righteous one in Christian tradition is Jesus. And so they take the lines from the Gospel of Matthew in particular and argue that the real descendants of Cain were the Jews because they were the murderers of the ultimate innocent one. And so that's a thread that gets pulled throughout history. When it gets to the American context, and this is where the Shem question gets really messy, there's a great book, well, I think it's a great book, Matthew Jacobson, Whiteness of a Different Color, right? And he begins that book by telling the story of a Jewish person talking to an Irishman. And the argument is the Jew white? And the Jew is like, I'm a white guy. What's the argument? And so part of what Jacobson does is he uses that story to frame how whiteness and Shemitics kind of works within the context of American, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, to try to get at precisely that question. So it becomes a much more complicated, it's like a 300-page book, recommended. But he kind of traces some of that context of how anti-Semitism still exists, but also develops this interesting racial cover that he tries to explore. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions before we jump to the text quickly? Okay. So, to put additional meat on the bone, if we could read Genesis 9, verse 18 through 27. So Genesis 9, 18 through 27.
The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan.
These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled.
Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard.
He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent.
And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside.
Then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it over both their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness.
When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him,
he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers."
He also said, "Blessed by the Lord, by God, be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave."
May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave.
After the flood, Noah lived for 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died.
All right, thank you. By now, your antennae should be tingling. All right. So, this to me is one of my favorite texts to study because it just shows the power of reception history. My fourth dumbest question: who is cursed in this story? Right, Canaan, the son. How many of you heard the phrase, the curse of Ham? Right. How many of you heard the curse of Canaan? Right. This is why, to me, reception history is such a powerful tool. Because what we have been taught is the exact opposite of what the text says. Cursed be Canaan. Yet everyone understands it as the curse of Ham. Why does Ham get cursed? Right, because he saw his father naked. Right, exactly. Right, and that's always one of those fun moments of like, the word of a hungover dude becomes like a pronounced curse from God for millennia. I just no shade for those who may be hungover, but really? Really? So, Ham is cursed. Well, Ham commits the crime, but Ham is not cursed. Why? Yeah. Yeah, so you're right. So Shem and Japheth cover, but Ham does not. So the question is, why is Ham not cursed if he committed the crime? Right. So this becomes a fun moment. Well, I don't know if it's fun. It becomes an interesting moment. So verse 9:1, God, knows the subject of the verb, blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, or replenish the earth, however they translate Malay. That phrase of be fruitful and multiply may sound familiar to you, because that is the first commandment God gives to human beings in Genesis 1. So Ham is already blessed. So I would argue the biblical writers realize you can't have a hungover dude come up and reverse God. Free theological ethics lessons, right? Drunk people do not override God, okay? So then why do you want a curse of Canaan? Here's where Hebrew Bible scholars make an interesting argument, and I think we're right, but I'm not God, so I haven't limited the possibility I could be dead wrong. Where do we know the Canaanites from in later biblical traditions? And unfortunately, it's in the news now. Exactly. Exactly. So, and we'll see this map in our final class, but the Canaanites own the land that will eventually become the promised land that Israel will inhabit. So what many scholars argue is, since this text is written after they've already gone into the promised land, then you need an explanation as to why you can take other people's land. So the argument that many scholars make is, well, this curse of Canaan is put in to explain why the Israelites have a right to that promised land. To your question, tell me your name again, sir, I'm sorry. Yes. Jim? Jim Blitch, okay, thank you. I feel like 3 Jims. Of how this lives. I mentioned a guy by the name of Ezra Stiles, who was a professor at Yale and gave a famous Elevated to Glory sermon about the holiness of America and God's chosenness. He does something in that sermon when I have students read it that always just trips me out. I'm like, dude, what were you smoking? Well, that was judgmental. I'm curious about his biblical hermeneutic and how he arrived at the conclusions. He begins that analysis by saying 3 things. Number 1, I make the assumption that America is the new Israel. Number 2, what he calls the Indians, what we would now call indigenous populations, they are the Canaanites of old. They are the Canaanites of old from the line of Shem. Yeah, you feel what his next line is going to be. And as a result, what God told Israel to do to them, we can do to today's Canaanites. About a paragraph later into that elevated sermon, as it is called, he then says, and it is clear that God cursed Ham. It is clear that God cursed Ham. And that is why the Negro is destined by God to be our slaves.
Did you tell us where this sermon was? Who's
Ezra Stiles, S-T-I-L-E-S. Since he's long gone to his fate, I don't mind mentioning his name. All right. Yes.
There was an Ezra Stiles College at Yale.
Yes.
And didn't they change the name of that?
Yes, in part because of this legacy. Absolutely. So I have 30 seconds left on my watch, so I'll wrap this up. Well, not fully wrap it up, but kind of put a pseudo bow on it. What also becomes important about how this text gets understood is this idea of, may God make space for Japheth, let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. Among the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, or Japheth, who seems to be the one in the highest position? Interesting. So, we're clear it ain't Ham. The question is Japheth leasing land from Shem? Or does Japheth own everything and happen to have a summer home in Shem's land? Right? And not just a metaphor, but hopefully you follow. Right? This verse gets interpreted, verse 27. This is the framework for European colonialism. That the idea of making space, or let space expand for Japheth, becomes the justification for European conquest. In America, we know that as manifest destiny. And if you go through the weeds of reception history, this story is part of what feeds that tradition. We will stop there because we have reached our end time. I believe it was like 1769. Yeah. So thank you all. So we'll wrap this up in Table of Nations.